Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy Skills Podcast. And today we have a very interesting guest. We have Jim Hemerling, who is a senior partner at the Boston Consulting Group San Francisco office. And what I want to do today is talk about the work he's been doing at the firm to understand how companies could develop these macro strategies to thrive given all the nationalism debates taking place, social upheavals, and the big changes taking place in technology. And of course, we're to a large degree and in the opening stages of each of these changes. Now, we're going to go through this discussion shortly, but what I want you to focus on is the work BCG has been doing, and it's not just Jim, I've spoken to several of the other partners about this as well, is about understanding what are those big moves that a company or any company could do across sectors, across regions. So it's not as if these are just moves that are particular to the United States. Of course, there are many US examples here. But if you look at a recent book they published and one of the articles put together, they've produced what I thought was a very interesting map whereby they list out all these trends are shaping out and what are the different moves companies can make. Some of the terminology is, of course, unique to BCG, which is pretty normal, but it's worth understanding how they're seeing the rise of ecosystems and how that impacts the world. It's one of the more interesting discussions I've had. I hope you will enjoy it, and let's get straight into it. Welcome, Jim. It's good to have you today.
Great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. So let's start, right? You're doing some pretty interesting work with your colleagues, Arundam and Nicholas. So does this work originate off some of the pieces BCG is doing with clients, or did you put together this thinking to take to clients?
Great question. The origination of this really has come from our work with clients, but also through research that Arundam, Nicholas, and I have been doing as BCG fellows, part of something that's called the BCG Henderson Institute. You could think of that as our think tank, where partners are given some time to actually, in addition to their work with clients, to conduct research into areas that they are particularly interested in. And so it was really the combination of insights from work with clients and our primary research.
So the thing that jumped up for me when I was reading the material is that, I read everything, and then the example that really stood out for me was the one you used of Microsoft. And the reason I liked that example is because there was no one thing that the CEO did that caused a shift in how, firstly, employees perceived Microsoft's vision and how the markets started perceiving Microsoft. It seemed to me he did a lot of little things to keep the momentum going and to reposition Microsoft. So what has Microsoft done differently to leverage some of these themes and trends you are talking about?
Yeah, so the chapter that you're referring to, where we talk about Microsoft fairly extensively, is the chapter that we call Embrace Always-On Transformation.
Yes.
And in the past, we would have used the view that a transformation was more like a sprint.
Yeah.
You would set it up, execute it, and then go back to this wonderful state we used to enjoy called business as usual. Well, as we know, in this new era that's being disrupted, that state is gone. And companies are now in a process where they're always transforming. And so I would say the starting point when Satya Nadella became the new CEO in February 2014 was he knew that he needed to transform Microsoft. Microsoft had faced a number of challenges over the years, but striking had been the gap that AWS had opened up in cloud services.
Yes.
And so there was clearly a fundamental transformation that would be required. Also, over the years, many had said that the real innovation engine in Microsoft had stalled. Yeah. And also there were many problems that have been written about very publicly around the culture, which had evolved over time to become somewhat inwardly focused and many would say toxically competitive. And so, he knew from the outset that Microsoft needed to transform, and he then embarked on what we would say is this always-on transformation journey. I would also say striking is that Satya was a student of transformation, as he is of many things, and he knew that the statistics on typical transformations were not very successful.
That's true.
Anywhere between 2/3 and 3/4 do not deliver sustained performance improvement. And so he challenged his leadership team to reimagine the approach of how they would actually take the transformation journey. And I would say that is really the thing that is most distinctive about what they've done. And the way that we describe that approach is we summarize it as the head, heart, and hands of transformation. And, just a few things that really stand out, I would say, and you've already alluded to this, that it wasn't one thing, it was many things, but, related to the head of transformation, that really was to envision a different future, moving away from a Windows PC-centric view of the world to his first articulation of a mobile-first, cloud-first vision. Also related to that was thinking that even that would not be necessarily fixed forever. And even 2 to 3 years into the journey, he revised the vision to be a vision which was intelligent cloud, intelligent edge. That intelligence was basically, everywhere now. So part of it was articulating a vision. Part of it as well is to align the leadership team around that vision. And something that he did is he took that to heart and instituted a policy where the top leaders would meet every Friday for 6 hours to debate, thrash out, and align on the future direction and guide the overall transformation. So, there were some things done very specifically on the head to get fully aligned against the vision and the big rocks needed to drive toward that. Jumping down to the hands, I would also say that, one of the real challenges in transforming in this environment is you cannot know day one everything that needs to happen. What you need is to have a way of executing where you're also innovating with agility. And so one of the things that Microsoft really has taken to heart is how do you use agile teams, cross-functional, co-located, even virtually, teams working in iterative sprints, using technology to enable the productivity of the team, focused very much on user and customer needs to deliver, product and service and even operational improvements. So a lot of it also was in the way that they actually, empowered those teams to really drive the transformation program elements. But the third element, which is really very important, is the heart of the transformation. And many people that are familiar with some of the things that Satya has talked about will know that he placed an enormous priority on the purpose or the new mission, articulated as to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And he's been very vocal in saying that every product we build, every technology we incubate, all has to be driven by that sense of that purpose, that mission, to inspire and guide everything we're doing. He's also done a lot of work at the heart around the culture, addressing that toxic, inwardly focused, hyper-competitive culture, and a very deliberate process to articulate, activate, and embed the new culture across the organization. And also, I would just say one last thing is around the leadership model itself. If you really believe that we're in an environment of constant change, then you lead leaders to be transformational leaders. And so he developed with the leadership team a model for leadership built around the head, heart, hands. He calls it create clarity, generate energy, deliver success. And that's what every leader needs to do. So those are some of the aspects of what makes the transformation story a really striking one that we wanted to feature in Beyond Great.
So if you look at Satya's personalities, I would only use the word laid back. I find him to be a very reserved person. On top of that, although he's not a lifer at Microsoft, he did crumb through the ranks a little bit, but he comes in to a company that has a reputation for fiefdoms that do not cooperate. At the same time, you talk about different trends facing the world, whether it's social tension, economic nationalism. I think the other one you mentioned was technology. So he has to first pick a trend he's going to leverage. Then he's going to have to pick a bet he's going to have to make on that trend, which he bet as cloud. And now it's easy to see the progress Microsoft made, but at the time they were not doing so well. So how does a guy like Satya go about getting the different factions to not operate as factions? How does he get the pieces to work in concert?
Yeah, great question. And I think, again, there's a few pieces to this. I think it actually starts from the purpose,
Yeah.
which is that our purpose is to, as I said, or as they have said,
Yeah.
to empower every person and every organization on the planet. Then it links to the vision and articulating very simply that the vision going forward at first is mobile first, cloud first, and then intelligent cloud, intelligent edge. So part of it is getting the vision. A lot of it is around how you work with the leadership team.
Mm-hmm.
You think about an organization like a pyramid. If the leadership team is not aligned, by the time you get down to the front line workers, you've got people moving in many different directions. And I would say what he recognized is the importance, and you can think about this on two dimensions. One dimension is having alignment. The other dimension is having autonomy. And he did not drive towards a command and control way of getting to alignment, because that would have crushed the autonomy. But also he knew he couldn't just have every team running off autonomously in different directions. So what he aimed for really was that sweet spot of alignment and autonomy. And to do that, again, it started with the senior leadership team. What was interesting is under Steve Ballmer, leaders would often come to him directly and they would broker arrangements one-on-one. And that was sort of a way of operating. Under Satya, what he said is, look, we can only transform this if we do it together. And so if there's anything important to discuss, then you need to bring it into the Friday meeting when we're all together, and we will thrash it out, debate vigorously, but it's there that we're going to get to alignment across the rest of the company. And I think part of it as well was just rallying everyone, as is indicated in the vision, that there really was going to be a fundamental departure from the past, that we had to move toward being, mobile first, cloud first. Also, Amy Hood, the CFO, played a very important role in this, which is, she had the idea of we need to change the metrics that we're using in order to guide and align us. And so she came up with a very powerful idea of every company, of course, has performance metrics. What do you need to do on a quarterly basis around customers, around the financial performance? But what she said is, let's also introduce power metrics. And the power metrics are those that are linked to the transformation. Are we actually delivering on the longer term transformational objectives? And so that use of power and performance metrics together has also been a very powerful way of getting alignment.
So it sounds like the leadership style that the CEO Satya has of Microsoft is diversity in counsel and unity in command. He forces diversity within the ranks when discussions are being made, but once a decision is made, they have to execute as a team.
I think that's an excellent way to summarize that, yes. And he does it, as you know, and you alluded to this, not in a bombastic
Yes,
style
absolutely.
But really the opposite. He's someone who is relatively quiet, very reflective, a deep, deep thinker, very inclusive in getting input from many people. But then, as you say, at some point, you need to decide and move forward.
So let's just step back a second, right? We spoke about Microsoft, and it is a example of a company that you guys have worked with, you guys know well, that has been able to leverage some of these big trends we see shaping the world today. One thing I found quite fascinating about your work is that when you talk about social tension, economic nationalism, and so on, you're one of the few people I've seen who don't point it out as being an anomaly. You almost treat this as if it's going to be here for a long time, and companies need to embrace this and find the opportunity. Do you find that there are companies who are almost fearful and hoping this will pass, and maybe they're the laggards, and then there are others who are saying, look, we got to get ahead of this, we got to make this work, we got to find a way to build a business model that leverages this? Is there two camps or more than one camp in the way they approach this?
I think what's happening is there's just over the past, I don't know, pick a number, 20, 30, 40 years, we had the luxury of operating in an environment of relative stability. You think of post-World War II and the relative stability, and also rules of the game that were relatively predictable and stable. I'll just pick one: globalization. Between 2000 and 2007, I led our practice in Greater China. And at that time, the emergence of China was viewed as a good thing everywhere. globalization was viewed as a good thing everywhere. The more of it, the better. Well, as you know, today, that's no longer the case. There are very strong sentiments around economic nationalism. And we've even seen during COVID-19, as supply chains have been disrupted, and as companies not only companies, but countries have turned to protect their own citizens, we've seen a pushback against the acceptance of globalization. We could also talk about the others around even, the fundamentals even of capitalism, as you know, are under tremendous pressure now, whether capitalism is even a good thing that should be embraced by companies. And we could go on. But what we're saying essentially is that no longer applies. We've shifted into an era that is constantly being disrupted. And, there's a lot of mathematical data around, things like the volatility index and so on. And so the data is just becoming overwhelming, that we're in an environment where disruption is now the new normal. And even, by the way, COVID-19, yes, it is a massive, painful disruption, but it is not unique. And we believe, as you said, there will be more of these. The question then is leaders, and how do you actually face into that reality and then start to adapt how you lead? And there, I think you are right in pointing out that some leaders have moved there very quickly, and they've embraced this new reality and are now figuring out how to operate in that environment, placing, for instance, much more emphasis on being resilient as opposed to just driving growth or just being efficient. But many other leaders, are still hoping, I think, that we return to more stable, peaceful times.
Yes. Well, I have to ask this next question, and I don't really know what the answer is. It's more, let's think about this for the audience. Is this view of all the dislocation and disruption and social tension, economic upheaval, is this a Western phenomenon, or is this also happening in the emerging markets to the same extent? If we went into Brazil, Argentina, Zambia, South Africa, would they say things are getting worse from 30 years ago? Or would they say, yeah, there are some bad things, but overall, no, it's pretty much the same?
That's a broad, sweeping question.
Maybe it's unfair.
No. I just want to be careful that I don't pretend that I can speak for each and every one of those countries. But look, I think if you go to those countries, if anything, those countries are used to their world being disrupted even more than the West.
Absolutely.
Even think of any of these disruptions. I mean, they've been dealing with the impact of climate disruption and the knock-on effect of that for many years. They've had social tension and social disruption, and many of them have come from, call it more socialist backgrounds, or have oscillated back and forth between embracing socialism and rejecting socialism. So I think, if anything, many of those countries that you just mentioned probably are much more used to assuming that the world is one of disruption and volatility. If anything, the stability has been more in the developed economies in the US and Europe than in many of those markets. So you might say they're actually a step ahead of how leaders need to think about leading in the new environment. They also know that the major economies, the US economy, Germany, the UK, Japan, that they have in many ways been setting the rules for the rest of the world, and they've had to respond to whatever changes those countries made. So that anyway, I just think that they may actually have an edge in dealing with the reality of the new world.
So what you're saying is, if I paraphrase you a little bit here for the audience, is that they're also seeing tremendous disruption, maybe even more. But the difference is it may be business as usual for them.
In some ways, I think that's true.
Okay, that's interesting. So what we're saying is that these factors, these trends, these tensions, they're affecting the entire world, but some countries may just have resiliency, or they're used to managing it, so it's affecting them, but they don't see it as something different. So switching gears here, right? One of the themes we're seeing is demographic changes, whereby Western economies are aging quite rapidly. Now, in your work, you talk about Omron and the work they did in Japan, but are you seeing other companies deliberately making the shift to prepare for an aging population? Are you seeing business models arise whereby people are taking this into account?
Well, you mentioned Omron. I would think outside of Japan, maybe Omron is not a household name,
Yeah,
like Pepsi or
that's
Nike.
true.
So just for your audience, Omron is a Japanese electronics company based in Kyoto in Japan, and they were established back in 1933. And they are known as a company that even from its founding has been a company that's not just about pursuing profits, but has embraced the obligation to serve society more broadly. And by the way, they're as I said, an electronics company. And so what they've done over time to embrace the demographic shift that is a very everyday present reality in Japan is to think about in the areas that they focus on, factory automation, healthcare, social systems, and so on, how do they actually address that need? And so for them, they're constantly looking at trends in society and the intersection with technology in the domains that they work in, and then looking for how does that create opportunities? Pretty much along the lines of what we say in chapter 1, which is do good, grow beyond.
Yes.
And so, for instance, they see opportunities. What are the things that aging people deal with? I mean, a lot of it is around health concerns. A lot of it is around people being less able. So, I mean, just a simple example, but they created an automated ticket gate system for used in rail stations. For those of you that have traveled to Japan, you know that while the rail system is unbelievably efficient, it is, you are jammed in like sardines.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge actually for older people to navigate in the crush of the crowd. So they've been very attentive to how do we actually help the aging population deal with rush hour crowds so that they're not injured, just trying to get on the train. And they've really been recognized for that. So anyway, that you had mentioned them. And so I thought I would just give the audience perhaps
That's a good idea.
Bit of insight into who they are. But I think, look, the aging society, that is going to represent a human resource challenge for corporations around the world. Obviously, it's very uneven, with Japan having one of the most aging populations, China having a very different situation with the one-child policy, having had a massive impact over the past 30 years on their demographics. And so, we're going to see a massive aging of the workforce. But all of this creates, both a challenge and an opportunity. More of an opportunity, say, in India, where you have a very young population, as you do in many of the developing economies. So look, I think are we seeing companies? Absolutely. But I think it really depends on, the nature of the industry sector that you're in. If you're in healthcare, pretty much around the world, you are dealing with this. And COVID has, of course, reminded us, every day of the reality of the fragility of an aging population. But I think it's, part of it is how do you develop products that help seniors cope with infirmity, as I said. Part of it is also around new approaches to distribution. How do you help seniors who may not be as mobile have access to services? Also, of course, there's new, care models that are being developed all the time to care for an aging population. I think also, interestingly enough, when you look at the workforce itself, it's one thing for young people to look at all of these digital technologies and to run toward them and to embrace them. But you don't have to be that senior. I'm not talking, I'm not talking senior citizens that are retired. I'm talking people in their 40s, in their 50s, who are now being asked to work with, technology in a way they just did not have to in the early parts of their career. And by the way, many of those are in leadership positions. So they're being asked to lead organizations in domains where they no longer actually really understand it, and they're not particularly comfortable with those technologies. So there's no question that it's a challenge that I think many companies are facing into in different ways, from both a customer opportunity perspective, but also from how do you upskill and address the transition of the workforce.
So how do you lead? If you go back to your work where you say technological revolution and upheaval is one of the big trends of the world, one of the big tensions, how do you as a leader gain foresight into something that you're not up to speed on? How do you make big bets, big decisions? How do you get ahead of the competitors? It's basically a battlefield for which you maybe not that equipped to lead. How do you do that? How are clients doing that?
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you. Thinking as I'm trying to respond in real time here. Fortunately, I would say, we did spend some time as we were developing Beyond Great, interviewing over 100 leaders around the world. And so what I want to do is I want to do justice to your question,
take your time.
drawing on the insights from those extensive interviews. One thing that we did is we did create a chapter that we call Beyond Great Leadership. And in that, we define 6 leadership imperatives that leaders that are on the journey of going beyond great, that they are already either pointing to as important or already living out. And so I think in those 6 imperatives, I think are some of the answers to your questions. I think part of it is, as we say, you need to lead with a conviction to positively impact society. I think that's a mindset shift.
Yes.
Yes, shareholders are still absolutely important. And by the way, we never, ever take a position that, shareholders are irrelevant or bad. They are still a very important stakeholder, but you need to go beyond. It is also about customers and employees and about suppliers and, of course, society more broadly. I think that shift in mindset or orientation or worldview already takes you in the right direction. As you alluded to earlier, when we were talking about Microsoft, part of it as well is shifting away from a command and control mindset, where you think you need to not only know where we're going, but everything about how to get there, and that you need to direct the activities. No. It's about getting alignment, but also having autonomy. And so you have to shift to more empowering and coaching. By the way, you have to guide, toward an open-mindedness, even about what is a corporation. I'll just, the one example that comes to mind is, for many years, we primarily thought of the corporation as the resources that are actually, employed by the company, plus suppliers. Now, of course, we talk about the importance of embracing ecosystems.
Yeah.
How do you create networks of partners, some of which actually compete with each other and at times collaborate with each other? So that's another shift sort of in leadership mindset, that it's, you're not going alone, you're going ecosystem of partners. A big one is modeling intellectual flexibility through constant learning. And, striking, we talked about Microsoft, at the heart of the transformation of their culture is what they call growth mindset, leveraging Carol Dweck out of Stanford, her brilliant work on fixed versus growth mindsets. The idea of, you're constantly learning, or as Satya loves to say, we need to shift from know-it-all to learn-it-all. I think that's part of it as well, that, you can't know it all, you can't possibly, but you can be constantly learning. Another one, by the way, is developing the ability to navigate through ambiguity, tension, and even paradox. This is back to the opening question around, are leaders leaning into this, or are they running from it? And, what we're saying is you need to accept the reality of a world of constant change, and then to lean into how do you navigate in that world. It's almost a simple metaphor is we're sort of going back, if you think about, the days of ships that were powered by wind. You couldn't actually control the wind, but you could learn to navigate. And that's kind of what we're saying. You can't control the wind, but you can learn how to navigate and leverage and harness the power of the wind, even though it's going to be constantly shifting on you.
So what you're saying is very, very useful. So I'm going to unpack it for the audience and we'll go from there, right? So the first thing is, to make it simple for the listeners here so they can follow what we're doing, is that what you're saying is that the same way a CEO will bring in an operations or CFO specialist to understand the finances and operations, he is going to have to work with someone who understands digital and technology. There's no difference from any other domain competency. But as you rightfully said, he needs to have a mindset of picking the philosophy of the company, getting everyone aligned, and moving in that direction, having the conviction to see it through. But then you said something interesting, which ties to one of the terms you used in your work, which I had never heard before. You talk about liquefying an organization. And it sounds to me here, what you're alluding to very well is that previously companies put out something and they expected consumers to come to it. But now with more competition and a more educated consumer base, and also a more educated employees, it's almost as if companies have moved away from telling employees what to do to enabling employees to be their best. And that's the way they're responding to things, by giving employees who are close to the front lines the tools to see what's happening and adjusting to what's going on. Is that a good way of capturing it?
I love that. I love that. What we're really saying, back to this framework, by the way, which I quite like, around, alignment and autonomy. Alignment is around the purpose, it's around the vision,
Yes.
it's on the strategy, it's about setting the direction. But autonomy is around teams that are empowered because they've been given, delegated responsibilities,
Yes.
but also because they've been given the tools and the skills to be able to actually have the power that they need in order to do what they're doing. And so it's getting that balance of alignment and autonomy with fully empowered teams able to actually do the work.
But empowerment is quite a scary thing if you think about it, right? Because if you're going to be, for lack of a better word, freeing up your employees to be their best, and where Ed Office takes the role whereby we're going to give you the tools, we're going to give you the competencies, we're going to give you the training so that you can connect with the consumer, build products and serve them well. At the same time, if you as a company is doing something wrong, your employees are going to tell you, hey, that's not the values that you aspire to. So it's a difficult thing, because I think on the one hand, you want to free your employees. But at the same time, when you have freed and educated employees, you have to be sincere about being social in what you're doing, right?
Absolutely. And you see this played out in the news every day.
Yes.
In a sense, the employees are rising up
Yeah.
and exercising this new autonomy, this new empowerment. It's almost as though, in the past, you think about it, leaders really had all the power.
Yes.
Because they directed the activity, and they also, at the end of the day, determined whether you were employed or not. In many ways, that's flipped. And it's remarkable, as you're saying, to see the amount of real power that even very junior people now have in an organization. And if they want to go on social media and they want to say that I don't agree with the policies of the company, they do that freely and openly. And so, yes, it's a very delicate balance to give people power, but then to try to direct and align that power, toward the goals of the enterprise. Absolutely.
But it's not as if it's not something that can be taken back. It's not as if we can move to a world whereby, not the government, head office gives out a communist style communique and everyone has to fall in line. We're never going to go back to that. With social media, smarter employees, as you say, a focus on total societal impact. We're educating our employees to care, but that means they also come back and say, yeah, but are we the right kind of company to do this? What can we do better? So in a manner of speaking, this philosophy of liquefying the organization is great if you're a CEO who wants to make your employees into little business owners. They're not just fixing customer problems, they're fixing the problems in the company as well. And it can be a bit scary if you're not ready for that, right?
Yeah. And it even, we talk a bit in the book about working in agile team. And you would know the chapter that is
yes,
that you need to become focused, fast, and flat.
Yeah.
The chapter that talks about the design of organizations in the future. Focused is all about focus on customers.
Yes.
And move away from organizations that were designed around products or around geography, and really focus them on the customer. Fast is about agile teams that are able to actually move at the pace of the change in technology. And then flat is a very important concept as well. Part of it is actually, literally flatten the organization. So there are fewer layers between the CEO and the customer, but also it's about leveraging horizontal technology platforms that enable horizontal communication and collaboration, and also enable the rest of the organization to have capabilities that they can access in these platforms. So that idea of focused, fast, and flat is a critical element of how you can lead in the future, but you can only lead if employees are now in an organization that is, as you said, able to move and adapt as the world changes. So it's a big shift away from the old command and control style of leadership and even the matrix structure that most leaders grew up in.
So in the book, when you talk about flat structures, I may be remembering the facts incorrectly, so correct me if I'm remembering it incorrectly, but you use the example of ByteDance, the owner of TikTok. And I think you mentioned that there's 100 senior people in that company reporting to the CEO or at the senior level. So they have an extremely flat structure. He doesn't have like 5 people reporting to him or 5 initiatives. Am I remembering that correctly?
100 leaders in the top 2 layers.
Yes, that's
below
correct.
the CEO. That's correct.
That's
so
unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. By the way, ByteDance, your readers, the audience, not everyone might know that they're the parent company of TikTok.
TikTok,
which I
yes.
imagine everyone does know about. And in behind that, I mean, everyone of course is very much focused on, who is the, latest TikTok star.
Yeah.
But in behind that, what's so interesting is there is this very powerful, very different way of organizing. And the concept of liquefying the organization was very much inspired by them, because what they say is we need to have a flat structure. We need to have flexible teams that are very much aligned against the customer and the user. But we also have to think of that as not a fixed permanent structure, but the one that is constantly morphing. And so that idea of liquefying the organization, forming and reforming teams, is something that's done on an ongoing dynamic dance, if you will.
Yes.
Very different than, the fixed structures around, the matrix that most leaders grew up in.
We're speaking about TikTok and ByteDance and so on. And one of your big tensions you mentioned is economic nationalism, where countries are almost taking a viewpoint that this asset is our asset and we need to protect it. But at the same time, you've got consumers who will gravitate to the technology and experience which is best for them. And TikTok is a great example of that. It doesn't matter what boundaries you're putting up, because the consumer is going to go where they want to go.
Yeah.
And you can't really stop them, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things we do talk about, is how we now have, truly a global consumer.
Mm-hmm.
In that, something like Pokemon Go, overnight almost.
Yeah.
Pokemon Go is a global phenomenon. And, social media, the rate of which information is moved around the world is by the hour, not by the week or the month. And so, that idea of the consumer being aware of and wanting what they want, where they want it, when they want it, is absolutely true.
When you use the example, which I really liked, of Netflix, and the fact that they went global in 7 years with their streaming. 7 years, global, 150 countries or something like that, which would have taken a traditional matrix-based organization with staff on the ground, setting up pilots, setting up an office. It would have taken them like 3 decades to do that, if they're lucky.
Yes, absolutely.
So you can move fast.
That was the old model. The old model was, to embrace globalization, but wherever you go there with your own assets, be they factories, be they distribution networks or sales force, but you went with your own assets, an asset heavy model. That was the old way of globalizing.
So you talked about value webs versus value chains. And I think the Netflix example is a good example of that. Because Netflix is creating a value web of suppliers who's doing the heavy lifting for them, checking the audience, building the products, and they use Netflix to distribute. It's a very good example. But at the same time, there's going to be a tension. We're already seeing that, whereby, for example, the French government is telling Netflix, you entered the French market, but now you have to invest.
Yeah.
And do you feel that, how do you see clients navigating that tension? The tension whereby with technology, they can go global rapidly, but at the same time, their presence is nowhere beyond, well, not nowhere, but it's not more than simply benefiting from the market. They're not really making an investment. How do they manage that?
Yeah, it's a great point. We come at that, I would say, in a couple of places. One is where we talk about do good, grow beyond, and embracing total societal impact. And part of that is, we think it's actually, you should do good because it's good to do good, but also it creates opportunities for growth. It also positions you to have a license to operate. And, there are companies that have or industries where this has been a reality for them for decades. You think about the mining industry. A company like Anglo American that we write about, the global mining giant. Anglo, wherever they've operated in the world, I mean, they've had physical assets, of course, because you have to go where the resources are, the minerals are. But they've also made a huge investment in upskilling the local workforce wherever they operate with new technologies, educating young people, building hospitals, building school systems, investing in the local economy so that they're making a positive impact. Now, you could say that, yes, but that's part of an asset-heavy model. I would say but still, the point is that they know
they're doing it
for decades that they have to invest where they operate in order to have a license to operate. You look at other companies, though, as we talk about in the book, that have embraced the asset light model. A company like Xiaomi, another Chinese company.
Yes.
Matter of fact, just today in the news, they passed Apple to become the third biggest global handset producer, just behind Samsung, which is a clear leader still, and then Huawei. But striking. And when were they founded? 2010.
10 years.
So just in one decade, they're now the third biggest global handset company.
And unlike Netflix, they make a physical product.
They do make a physical product. And that's what's interesting about this, though, because even as you think about how would they expand, you might say, well, they need to build factories everywhere. They need to build distribution everywhere. But they haven't taken that approach. Once they had established a significant position in the Chinese market, they then looked to expand beyond. The first place they went is Singapore, and they set up distribution in Singapore. But the big move for them, the big play, was really India.
Yeah.
But when they went to India, you might say, well, wouldn't India require that they build factories and distribution and so on? In fact, what they did is they formed a partnership with a very well-established leading e-commerce marketplace called Flipkart. Flipkart has done all of the distribution and sales and servicing for Xiaomi products sold in India. And in record time, well, first of all, not within months or within days, but actually within seconds, they originally sold out online everything that they had targeted for the Indian market. So the market took off much faster even than they anticipated. But they've gone on to gain 27% of the Indian market. Now, you might say that, how did they do that? How do they have the license to operate? Well, they're not creating factory jobs and they're not setting up their own distribution. They are certainly creating a much bigger employment base for Flipkart as they're selling, distributing, and servicing, all of those phones. But also, very importantly, they're creating all of the indirect secondary benefits of having a much broader reach of cell phones across India. And, all of the secondary benefits that come from people having access to internet services. So, if you think about it a bit more expansively than just building factories and distribution, you can start to see how companies can expand virtually or in an asset light manner and still have a very positive impact on the countries they enter and therefore, have the license to operate. By the way, they're also investing in of course, the training and development of the people that are selling and servicing their products. And so, that also is, of course, creating, assets in the countries they operate in.
Those are good examples. I mean, there's 2 points here that are very important. I think the first one is coming back to what you said about Satya Nadella and other companies you referenced. The starting point is having a leader who is of the mindset that says, we can do this differently. And we don't need to, that's really the most important point, because if there's a leader there who in his mind fervently believes the only way to grow internationally is to build factories, build supply chains over many years, then the company is going to go down the wrong path, right? And then the second point you make, which I think is a very, very good point, and I'm sure the Netflix executives will be making notes and taking this when they go to France, is that Netflix doesn't have to have any presence in France because of the multiplier effect. It's buying programming from French production companies, which is then paying salaries, which is then paying suppliers, which is keeping that supply chain alive, which is keeping the French language in circulation around the world. So what you're saying is that it's not only the old assets that show investment.
Yes,
there are other ways to do it.
Now, I still would say, every country will make their own determination.
Sure, yes.
When you've done enough. But I can tell you, and this is what we see very powerfully in the stories that we write about in Beyond Great, is that companies that have consistently, and I'm talking over not just years, but even decades, have consistently embraced total societal impact and having a positive impact on society, they operate under a very different halo, a brand where they're associated with not being mercenaries, but being there to do good and grow beyond. I mean, Unilever is a fantastic example of that. I mean, obviously a very global company. And yet for many years now, under Paul Pullman, the former CEO, chairman, he really, really started them on this path to say that we're not just a company that is going to produce great products and profit for our shareholders, but we are going to fully embrace having products that are good for the environment, that are socially responsible, that are creating employment opportunities for people in the markets that we operate in. And they are known for that. And so you have to believe, which is true, when they show up and have conversations about what they're doing in markets, they start from a totally different starting position.
So one example I really liked in the work is that when we tend to talk about technology and disruptions of the market and so on, many books and themes tend to get caught up into the latest technologies, which affects the top 10% of the population. But you have an example of John Deere. And if you think about it, the majority of the world is still largely agricultural based in emerging economies. And even in the United States and developed economies, agriculture is a big part of the population. And you have examples of how they're using technology and AI not to simply make their products better, but to develop new services that allow farmers to use the products better. And I thought that was a fantastic example of whereby you're combining new capabilities to make an age-old practice better. Now, obviously, farmers differ around the world. Some of them are quite advanced in the way they use technology and so on. But I'm pretty sure John Deere is adapting this for different markets where the literacy around technology may not be as high. Can we talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm so glad you went there, because I think you're right. People tend to, when they hear technology, they automatically think Silicon Valley or increasingly, Shanghai. And so I think in this example, what you're saying is it's not just about companies that were born technology companies. This is also a phenomenon that's impacting very traditional, companies. If you think about agriculture, it's one of the oldest of all human industries. It's also one of the most complex, and that's what people don't really understand. The farmer success or failure hinging on the vagaries of weather, soil conditions, also numerous operational decisions. As we also know, the way that farmers farm also has an enormous impact on climate. And some of the most interesting research coming out now and being popularized by books or movies, Kiss the Soil, is showing us just how important the way we treat the soil is in the ability to capture carbon and help us mitigate the impact of climate change. So the reality is there's a lot more to farming than just drop the seeds in the ground and then harvest the crop. So John Deere, which of course is one of the world's preeminent manufacturers of farming equipment, also construction equipment, they really identified, and in an inflection point for them was around 2012, when the company really embraced the importance of leveraging technology and also data. And they rolled out the kind of first version of this in what they called My John Deere, which was a digital platform that farmers could use to oversee their fleets of equipment and to operate more efficiently and more effectively. The analogy I like to use is, think of it as almost the Tesla version of a factory of a tractor. It's like, they said, okay, yes, there's a vehicle, but what it really is it's a computer on wheels. And so what they did is they said, what are all of the challenges that a farmer faces in terms of understanding the soil conditions, understanding the impact of weather, understanding different crops, understanding herbicides, fertilizers, shifting in weather patterns? What are all of the challenges that the farmer faces? And then how can we leverage data to bring that to the farmer in real time so that they can fully optimize the mix of seeds and fertilizer and herbicides and crop rotation and so on and so forth to be able to optimize the yield of farming. And to do that in a way that actually preserves the integrity of the soil, which of course is critical. So anyway, that's what they've done. I think striking, because you've talked about leadership being important in all of this and having the right mindset. I think it is not a coincidence that the person who has now become the CEO, John May, was actually someone that came up through technology, was CIO, was very much involved in the birth of my John Deere, and that he recognized that, was able to mobilize resources for them to start to move down this path, and ultimately now has become, the CEO of John Deere. I think another company that we also write about is Nike. Yeah. Nike, you think of them as, footwear and apparel. Yes. But of course, over the last few years, they've made a very important pivot, if you will, in their global operating model, which is they made the decision that they would not cede the direct connection to their consumer to Amazon. And having done that, it's one thing to say that, but then what? Yeah. What that meant is they then truly had to embrace becoming a digital company. And so, it's another company that you might think of as a fairly traditional company, obviously excelling at branding and athletic, footwear and apparel, but they've, over the last few years, have been transforming into a true digital company. And I think it's, again, not by accident that one of their board members, John Donahoe, who grew up in Silicon Valley, at eBay, ServiceNow, was on the board of Nike, was then chosen to be the CEO, in recognition that the future is becoming a truly digital company, and we need a leader who really understands what that takes.
When I used to, many years ago, work with companies as a partner, I always used to tell CEOs that strategy comes down to the series of conversations you're going to have with your executive team. That's what strategy is, right? So now I'm thinking that there are definitely discussions going on in companies whereby someone is saying, hey, hold on a second, John Deere's core business is the mechanical and engineering side of manufacturing vehicles. And then there's another party saying, hold on a second, we have to go digital. Our core has to change. So you've got this tension here because on the one hand, it's very easy to say that, to define your core too narrowly. But what you're saying is that all these tensions are forcing companies to rethink what their core is. And that's not an easy discussion to have because it's very easy to put together the analytics to support either side. I mean, how do CEOs think this through? How do they weigh off the pros and cons?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest challenges for leaders going forward. Again, I think there's a few things that I would point to. I think one of them is really starting with the customer, or even better, start with society more broadly, and really what are the needs and the trends that we're seeing, really starting customer back. I think that there's a lot of power already in that. I think also it is, to be making sure that, you and your leadership team, even if you did not grow up in technology companies, that you spend time with them. And so over the years, as you would know, many companies have made the pilgrimage to Silicon Valley. And yes, just being there, and I've accompanied, many clients in doing exactly that over the years, just seeing that world. And yes, how those companies operate, how the ecosystem operates, the connection between the major companies, the smaller suppliers, the ecosystem, the companies that are, venture capital, and how they think about the market and where to invest, where not to invest. There's something about, immersion in that world that is helpful. Another key part of it is also acquisitions. Striking the two examples we were talking about, John Deere and Nike, both of them have made several acquisitions in the technology space. They've recognized that if we want to move at the pace we need to move at, yes, we need to develop our people organically. We need to invest in upskilling our people. As we say in the chapter, thrive with talent. But in many cases, it's not enough. To move faster, you actually have to acquire in companies that are already leading in different domains of technology, partly for the technology, but largely for the talent. And to see, when those people show up and are infused into, the more traditional core business, there's just changes that happen. There's a way of talking, there's a way of thinking that is very different. And so part of it is, how can you accelerate the building of capabilities in the organization? So I think those are a few things that I would point to of how companies, start with the customer, make sure that you are immersed in the technology and the changes that are being driven by that, and then do what you need to do to really accelerate the building of capabilities.
What you're saying is so important, but also it's so classical, because you're saying, which people should know, is don't worry so much about what your best-selling product is. Don't worry so much about what your core is. Think about what the customer wants and what they're going to want, and then assemble those skills to serve them.
Yes.
It's marketing myopia, Theodore Levitt, 1970, right? It's not new. It's not new stuff, but it's
right.
Interesting that every generation needs to be reminded of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, any final thoughts before we wrap up, Jim? I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you. I think the examples were fantastic, and I think the idea is I think at a time like this, we need to remind leaders that with change comes opportunity. It's interesting, but it's not bad.
Well, and by the way, thank you for this opportunity. And I've also really enjoyed the discussion. I would say just a couple of things in closing. I would say really this starts with a recognition, as we say in the introductory chapter to the book, we say great is no longer good enough.
Good, yes.
And for us, great, there was a time when great was good enough.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that long ago. Great being great for shareholders only.
Yes, good point.
In an environment of relative stability, where being efficient and developing good products was good enough. And what we're saying is the starting point is to face into the reality that great is no longer good enough. I would start there and do what you need to do with your leadership team to help them to really understand, are we still living in the old world where we think great is still good enough? Or do we need to embrace the new reality? That's the starting point. I think a second point I would say, and just following a little bit the structure of the book, you do need to take a more holistic approach to this. Mm-hmm. You even said that it's not just one thing.
Yeah.
And it's not just one thing. And by the way, there are many books that are very good one thing books, and
yes.
there's a place for them. Beyond Great is not that. Beyond Great is an attempt to say, what are the strategies that you need to bring together to actually go beyond great? And we've organized them, as you know, around the three themes of growing beyond, operating beyond, and organizing
mm-hmm.
beyond. And so I think you also need to think about, where are we on the journey, beyond great in each of those areas. And we've actually developed a Beyond Great diagnostic, to help.
Yeah, I've seen that. That was very good.
Think about where are you on that journey? And I think that diagnostic can be very helpful. And then the last thing I would say, and this probably won't come as a surprise to you because we talked about it already a fair bit. The last is where we end the book, which is the chapter on Beyond Great leadership.
Mm-hmm.
That for this to happen, it's going to take leaders that are embracing these imperatives of Beyond Great leadership. Thinking about total societal impact, thinking about the importance of lifelong learning, thinking about how do you become comfortable with coaching and empowering versus command and control, embracing always on transformation, and also the ambiguity inherent in this new era. So I would say the last thing I would say is it also is going to require leaders leading in new and very different ways in order to lead their organizations beyond great.
But there's a good point you made here. I just want to touch on that before you go. We're not saying shareholders are not important. We're not saying shareholder value, total shareholder return is not important. What we're saying is that to compete in the world today with a more educated consumer and a more activist consumer, you need to consider more than just shareholder value in the short term and long term. That's what Beyond Great is about.
Absolutely. That is exactly right. To shift from shareholders only to embracing the broader set of stakeholders, and also to acknowledge that you need to do that in an environment where disruption and change is the norm, and to just, live into that reality.
Thank you so much, Jim. An absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.